Hello and welcome to this review of my Olivetti ET121 keyboard. I bought this keyboard for £20 off of eBay, and as it turned out, the seller was actually a loyal viewer of mine. It's a good deal anyway, as I've been wanting to show you Olivetti snap action switches for a while, so £20 was not too bad for a board with them. Except the board turned out to not be Olivetti snap action, but an Olivetti with snap action switches. As it happened, this one actually came with Alps switches that appear otherwise more or less identical. To give some background info, these Olivetti snap action switches are not that easy to find, because they're a very old design and didn't survive very far even into the 80s. For reference, this Olivetti Keyboard 1, which is an XT class keyboard, already came with their apparent successor, Olivetti Domed Slider, which maybe I'll get to show you one day as well. In any case, only the really old Olivettis had these switches, so getting hold of one took a while, especially for a doable price. Imagine my surprise when I took a cap off and saw a mount that was very obviously not Olivetti, who use a very unique and easily identifiable mount, but instead saw a vintage Alps mount, namely the same one that was also used an Alps magnetic reed, and to confirm my suspicion, there are Alps logos on the PCB. So what the hell is going on here? Well, on the inside, the mechanism is exposed as the switches don't have bottom housings, and I'd say that it looks very similar to that of Olivetti snap action, of which you can see a reference picture here. There are some differences with how the slider looks, both on the outside and the inside, but other than that, they really appear to be the same. Now, there are a couple of things that could be going on here. Considering the board is Olivetti but appears to have been made by Alps, it could be that Alps developed the switches and that Olivetti later made their own version of it, either under license or they simply cloned it with a different mount, or Alps made the later versions as well, just with a new keycap mount. In that case, they probably just third-partied, much like they did for Asian IBM keyboards, for example. What little I could find about these switches didn't show an Alps logo on the Olivetti mount version, but that doesn't mean anything necessarily. Olivetti do have a patent for this switch dating from 1978, so quite early, and I couldn't find an Alps one. But that's not so strange because Alps have thousands of patents spanning a seemingly endless amount of switches, so it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. I'd say considering how little information we have and how unlikely we are to get a significant amount more now, it is very difficult to tell what the relation between the two switches and companies was. However, that they're very similar is obvious. The ET101 was among Olivetti's first electronic typewriter models made in the early 80s, and it was also one of the earlier daisy wheel printers. Olivetti did make computers as well at some point, and in fact still do among other things, as they're still operational. However, they're probably most well known for their old typewriter models, which were very high quality. Olivetti had a worldwide reputation at the time. Also, stereotypically Italian, I guess, they spent an enormous amount of money on the styling and visual design of their products, and even their offices and factory buildings, many of which were designed by famous architects. Although by the early 80s, computers were already starting to become widespread, especially after IBM brought out the PC in 1981, typewriters were still in large-scale use. This keyboard is apparently detachable from the typewriter, much like a drop-in replacement module, but it comes with a steel skirt that makes it look almost like it has a housing of its own, although all of this originally resided inside the typewriter. And yes, that means that the typewriter that surrounded it was even bigger than this thing. This module is 48 by 22 by 18 centimeters, or in the, of course, extremely intuitive and relatable imperial measurement units, roughly 4 9/14 index fingers wide, 3 10/11 crooked pinkies deep, and a little bit over 2 thumb bits tall. There are 2 bus connectors on the left that it apparently communicated to the typewriter through, which means that someone with some programming savvy could probably wire up a converter for this if they wished to. Nonetheless, despite not technically having a real housing, the weight is a bit over 2.1 kilos, or in imperial units, about 4 bottles of giraffe piss. So, impressive, that's roughly the weight of an IBM Model M keyboard. This is probably because the housing skirt is as much as 1.25 millimeters thick, or in imperial units, about 1/196th the height of a carton of milk. In fact, if you don't mind a floating switch design where the switches are visible from the side of the keyboard, nor keeping a mat under it to protect your desk from being scratched to hell and back again by the housing skirt, I guess you could think of it as having a case already, despite the bottom being open. The keycaps are pretty thick ABS double shots, and yes, they're very dirty underneath. This board is far from clean. They have spherical key tops too. Don't even bother looking for these switches in boards with cylindrical caps, I'd say. And they remind me a little bit of Marquardt caps. Some pretty cool symbol caps among them too. Nice. Also, you might have noticed that it has a QWERTY layout. Now, I know what you're thinking, but no, the W and Z keys haven't been exchanged. They're a different row profile, so that would have been obvious. Moreover, some other keys are strange as well, such as M being next to L. In fact, I've seen other boards with this layout too. It's actually an old Italian layout, which makes sense, of course, with Olivetti being Italian. However, I've also seen QWERTY models, and nowadays Italy mostly uses QWERTY too, from what I understand. Now, back to the switches again, because I've only talked about them briefly so far. The mechanism is very similar to Alps plate spring switches, which itself is a design similar to IBM's beam spring design, albeit more simplistic and yet with more parts per switch. The main thing is this pre-tensed frame here, which, when enough force is applied, suddenly inverts, which causes a tactile feel as well as a clicky noise. I've previously described it as being like one of those vacuum test food jars, which is more or less exactly the same idea. Futaba MA are also a very similar design in which the plate spring is this spiral-shaped thing here. So you have a plunger which has a pusher with a coil spring inside, and this pushes on the plate spring frame, of which one corner is permanently down on the PCB, and in the middle is a flexible contact which hits another point on the PCB when it inverts. The sound is very obviously clicky, and somewhat surprisingly, the return click isn't very loud, which is weird because you'd think that the re-inversion back to its normal state should happen just as vigorously as the initial inversion, but it's clearly a lot more muted. The sound is very unique, and like other plate spring switches, it doesn't ping, which is most unusual, especially for a vintage keyboard. The plate does, very slightly, but the switches themselves not at all. Tactility-wise, it's rather strange though. The tactility on the downstroke is completely negligible. It's by far the closest I've ever come to a clicky linear switch. It's so faint and weak that I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be able to locate it at all without the clicky sound giving it away. Even MX Brown are about an order of magnitude more tactile than this. However, and this is a trait it shares with another plate spring switch, specifically Futaba MA, the tactility on the upstroke is stronger than that of the downstroke. This one is still not very strong, but it's quite sharp and actually noticeable, provided you press it very slowly. And this gives it an overall very strange feel. I'm still not sure whether I like Futaba MA or not, and this one is kind of in the same boat. I can't even make my mind up which of the two I prefer, although the Futaba switches are noticeably more tactile and stiffer. I don't know, this kind of switch just really throws me off for some reason. It's hard to put my finger on, if you'll pardon the pun. Much like the SMK Dome switches I reviewed recently, if you take a loose switch out, it's actually quite tactile, but inside a keyboard the spring can't invert fully, which is why it can't deploy its full tactility. It's not bad though, it really just feels like a clicky linear switch. The switches vibrate slightly when you press them, which I guess you could mistake for tactility, but it's not really. Not unsatisfying though. Anyway, vague tactility babbling aside, it's an intriguing keyboard. They don't feel at all like I thought they would, but it's pretty cool. Check it out if you're interested in clicky linear switches. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.